So the question is, why is time management so difficult? Why is it that people who've done exceptionally well at all the previous levels of the education system and got themselves into a PhD, why do they struggle when it comes to PhD level? I think one of the reasons is the difference, the fundamental difference between everything you've done before and what you need to do now. So at undergraduate level, or preceding that, you always had a predictable structure. So you had a set syllabus, you had a set timetable, you had standardized exams, you knew exactly what was going to happen and when. And as long as you showed up and did what you were asked to do and learned what you were asked to learn, if you were smart, you'd probably do okay. And given this structure, you maybe didn't even need to work that hard, in order to get through. But when it comes to a PhD, you no longer have that predictable structure. Instead, you have a unique project. You might have some deadlines, but you don't really have a clear timetable, and it's up to you to make your own decisions about what to do and when. And this is difficult because what if you make the wrong choice? The stakes are so high. And when you're making these decisions in your project, it's not like you know what's going to be on the test. It's not like you can just study those things and have that certainty that if I do this, I will get the result. Everything kind of feels a little bit risky. And when we're unsure what to do, or when we're tired, or when we're stressed, a universal aspect of human behavior is that we tend to revert to habit. And so when we're facing this uncertainty and all of these choices, what we tend to try and do is try and impose some of that familiar structure that we're used to, right? So we make a plan, we make to-do lists, we make timetables, we set self-imposed deadlines. And this gives kind of reassuring feeling of predictability and control, right? So you can sit down no matter what's going on, and you can do a nice color-coded Gantt chart, and you can set a timetable for the week, and you can say, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and I'm going to get so many things done, and I'll have this done by lunchtime, and I'll have an amazing week. But we often base these plans on an idealized version of the future. Now, sometimes this is because we're just ambitious, but also sometimes it's because when the supervisor's asking, when are you going to have this done? We want to impress them with our timescales. And so we tend to imagine the minimum possible time to get something done where nothing at all goes wrong, everything goes to plan, and everything, just happens the way it should happen. There's also the assumption that our future selves will be this amazingly productive, perfect student, and will actually follow through and do what's on the plan. But then, inevitably, we fall behind because in research, things go wrong all the time. It's probably the one thing that is actually predictable is that no matter how well you plan, no matter how well you prepare, no matter how much literature you read, no matter how much you talk to people and say, does this make sense? It will go wrong. And this is not a reflection on your ability, it's just the nature of research. And if you think about some of the big, huge research projects, so let's say the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, when that first opened, it broke down. And they spent billions and billions and had the best minds, and even then it went wrong. So if they get it wrong, you going in as a first year PhD student, things will probably go wrong as well. So it's the one thing that is predictable is that you will face problems. Secondly, almost everything that you do will take longer than you think. Now, this might be because things are going wrong, or it might be administrative delays. So I remember at one point in my PhD, I ordered a laser, little LED laser, fairly cheap, fairly small. I think it took about 3 months for that to pass the safety inspection, which delayed everything. I wasn't allowed to use it. Or you might be waiting for ethics approval or anything else. So there are all kinds of things that can add up to make things take longer than you think. And of course, your future self might be unreliable. And all of these plans depend on you actually showing up and doing what you've intended to do. And when you're under stress, it's not always easy to do that. So the one thing to take away is that no research plan ever survives first contact with reality. So what we tend to end up in is this kind of cycle of doom, where we start off with a plan, and we're all excited and we're ambitious and we're going to do amazing things, and that feels good. But then things go wrong, we fall behind, That feels stressful, but we keep working, we keep working, we keep working, we fall further and further behind, the stress builds up until you decide, oh, I need to get more done. Let's sit down, let's make a new plan, do a nice color-coded Gantt chart, let's make a plan to get up at 5 in the morning and get loads of things done. That feels good, but again, we fall behind. And that leads to stress and more stress and more stress and more stress. Okay? Because when we're unsure what to do, we tend to revert to habit. So we can also end up in this loop where we end up procrastinating, we end up disengaging with the work, or in some cases, rushing work. So the response might be to just work harder, just work faster, just work longer hours. But very often that's actually counterproductive. But then maybe, again, we decide, well, that's not working, let's make a new plan. So to avoid these cycles, we need to look at how we make plans and how we treat them. Planning is obviously important, but there are things that we need to consider. We need to look at what we do when things go wrong, if it's inevitable that things will. And we need to look at our default habits and routines and what we do when we're under stress and what we do when we're not sure what to do next. So to break this down, let's talk about 2 different modes of working. So number 1, this is what I call the production line. So this is what you're familiar with, where you have a timetable, you have a set process, you have to-do lists, and it's just a matter of showing up and doing what you do. So if you think about a production line, everything is about set processes. Everything is predictable. So when Apple are producing iPhones, there is a process that everybody on the production line needs to follow, and there's no room for creativity. And it's all about efficiency and optimization. That mode of working is really important, to get things done and to a high standard. However, this only works for the tasks that you've done many times before, where you have a set process that you can just follow. Because then you can predict exactly how long it will take, and maybe you can optimize the process to go a little bit faster. And this work is often boring, kind of routine, not very exciting, but you can basically just make a to-do list, set targets, and go. Where was I? Yeah, so these kind of techniques work well for this kind of work, the production line work. But then you'll have the other mode of working, which is to do with innovation and creative problem solving. So going back to that analogy with the Apple production line, Apple is kind of known as an innovative company, or at least they market themselves that way. So behind the scenes, they'll be working on all kinds of different things, right? They'll be trying lots of different things that you'll probably never see. They'll be trying folding screens. They'll be trying all kinds of stuff, some of which ends up in production. So what they need to do is play, try stuff just to see what happens, right? And then once they've figured out what works, then they can go into the productive mode and make a decision to say, well, this is going to go in the iPhone 18 or 19 or whichever number they're on. So we need those 2 different modes of working. So for these tasks that you've never done before, or when they throw up unexpected problems, you need to be in this kind of innovative, creative problem-solving mode. So you need to be flexible. You need to think outside the box, and try different approaches. And this is where you need to slow down and take the pressure off from productivity. Because if you're trying to produce, if you're so focused on the results and the end product, then you can't see those other potential solutions. So you need to slow down. You need to think of lots of different options. You need to try lots of different things, and you need to be okay, crucially, with making mistakes. And this is something I think PhD students often struggle with, because you're so used to passing exams. You're so used to getting it right. You're so used to getting the A+ in everything that you do, that it can be quite demoralizing when you're sat in the lab and you're doing an experiment for the 100th time. And it's, in my case, sometimes it was 2 in the morning and you just want to beat your head against the equipment because it's just not working. Okay. You need to be okay with that things are not going to work first time, and you have to try lots of things in order to find the right solution. Okay. So these 2 modes of working, So we've got the productive side, which is very predictable. We want to go for efficiency. It's also typically quite decisive. So you make a decision about what you're going to do. And then it's all about being focused on output and trying to get things right. So avoiding mistakes. So this is good for the routine tasks and getting work finished. And then we've got the creative side, which is unpredictable, inefficient. It's a lot more open, and it's focused on problem solving and trying things out and making mistakes. And the problems that people often face come from being in the wrong mode at the wrong time. So this could be doing something for the very, very first time and saying, right, I'm going to do this experiment. I'm going to impress my supervisor with these amazing results, and I'm going to get published in Nature and win the Nobel Prize, and everything's going to be amazing. Whereas actually what you need to do is learn the basic skills and figure out how to use the equipment, try things out. Or it may be that you've got 3 months left to finish your PhD, and you see the shiny new idea and you think, oh, I'll do these experiments and it won't that be exciting, and not focusing on just getting things done. So it's being in the right mode at the right time. But what you'll need to do is shift from one mode to the other, back to the other, back to the other, constantly throughout your PhD. So whatever you aim to do, I'm going to start out with some kind of plan. Right? How are we going to approach it? So if it's something which is routine, you can just make a list and do it. But if it's a novel task, which you'll often be doing when you're working at the edge of knowledge, then what you need to do is make a plan for how you will approach the problem rather than how you will get the result. Okay? And then assign time just to work on that problem rather than setting a deadline, because you've got to do it first before you figure out how long it will take. So we start with an initial plan. Then when things inevitably go wrong, what you need to do is slow down, but crucially, stay engaged with the problem. The temptation might be to work on something else just to stay busy, but the only way you can solve a problem is by staying engaged with it. In my case, what I often did, especially in the early stages of my PhD, was I'd often find an excuse to go online and check email. So something went wrong in the lab, and that gave me an escape. And it was almost like an anesthetic almost, because it stopped me thinking about the problems in the lab. But it meant that I was denying myself the opportunity to solve the problems that were coming up. So it was only when I started taking a walk around the campus when I was really stuck, getting away from the internet and giving myself some time and space to think, that I actually started solving some of the problems. So when things are wrong, you need to slow down, stay engaged, and let go of that productivity mode. Consider your options, make a decision, make a new plan, try it out, and then when things go wrong, we go through this constant cycle. So then, how do we actually apply this on a day-to-day basis? One of the things that I think is really important is to avoid a situation where you're starting the day, opening up your computer, and you don't know what you're going to do. Because if you're in that situation, you open the computer, first thing you'll do is check email. Then you've got maybe 20, 30 emails, you reply to all of those. But then while you're there, you might as well check the news headlines, because that's justifiable. It's good to know what's going on in the world. That will totally just be 5 minutes, and then you'll get to work. But then in those 5 minutes, maybe you've got some more emails, right? And then maybe you check social media, and you end up in this loop where you've got all of this incoming information. You still haven't made a decision about what you're going to do. And then it's such a wrench to drag your attention back to actually do the work. So we want to avoid that situation where you don't know what you're going to do at the start of the day. So we want to start each day with a very clear idea of what you're going to do. And then you want to start it as soon as possible. So maybe check email very, very quickly, but then it's got to be straight to the particular task that you decide is the priority. Your brain will think of all kinds of justifications for why you need to do this other thing first. Could be checking email, could be something else, but it will come up with some reason to just do this first, and then I'll do the work later. But what that does is it reinforces that habit of whenever you're not sure what to do, you avoid it, you do something else. Right? And as much as you justify to yourself that you will do it later, it will actually be more difficult to do it later because you've trained your brain that that's an effective solution to the anxiety that you're feeling. So anytime you catch yourself saying, I'll just do this first and then I'll do that later, you won't. There's no reason to assume your future self will be more motivated than you are now. So you want to minimize that delay at the start of the day. So if you take one thing away from this talk, try and do that. Try and start something as early as you possibly can in the day. Again, my own mistakes throughout my PhD. So I would often arrive a little bit late, sort of 9:30, 10-ish, but then there would be a tea break. So I'd check my email and then it would be, oh, well, it's only 20 minutes to the tea break. There's no need to, there's no point starting anything now. And it just reinforced that habit. So I lost probably months worth of time just from that one thing. So key takeaway, start as soon as you possibly can. Then to make this easier, try and take some time at the end of each day to take stock, set your priorities for the next day, and decide what it is that you're going to do first. So if you take 10, 15 minutes just to dump your ideas down on paper and decide what is the number one priority that I'm going to do tomorrow. Also take stock of anything that you need to be somewhere at a particular place. Those things tend to take care of themselves. But for everything else, you want to decide what is it that is my number one priority for the next day. And then review that in the morning and start as soon as possible. Okay. So then the next element we need to look at is how you train your focus. So once you start the work, there's going to be, again, all of these temptations to go check email, go do something else, put off the work that you're doing. So one of the techniques I find quite useful is a variation on what's called the Pomodoro technique. So the Pomodoro technique, it's one of these time management things. Basic idea is that you set a timer for 25 minutes. You do focused work on a specific task for that time. And then after 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break. Now, if you're really, 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 really struggling, I think that can be quite effective. But 25 minutes is barely time to get started with most tasks. So what I tend to do, especially if I'm writing, is I'll try and work in 45-minute blocks. Now, if I just lose track of time and I can just churn out, 2,000 words, great, but it doesn't always work that way. So I'll aim to work in a 45-minute block. Enough time to get something significant done, not so much time that you end up exhausted. And then I'll use a stopwatch rather than a countdown timer so that the alarm doesn't go off. So if I do get into the flow, then I'm not disrupted by it. And it means that after 10 minutes, look at my watch, so long to go, but just bring your attention back. Then another 10 minutes, or it might be 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how distracted I am. But if you just say I can get through to the end of this 45 minutes, then what tends to happen is the brain settles down, and then you can get into the work. Then once the 45 minutes is up, so once my attention drifts and I look at the watch again, so okay, more than 45 minutes, I can take a short break. Crucial thing is that you don't then go online during the breaks. So if you're working on something difficult, which you probably will be as PhD students, when you stop work, if you just check email, then you've got a flood of information. But if you get away from screens and just let yourself be in your own head, then your brain will carry on working on that problem. So maybe you go make yourself a coffee, something like that. And even if you're not consciously thinking about it, your subconscious will be able to process it and chew it over. But again, the online information is just this barrage of fluff, right? That has no real positive value other than acting as an anesthetic. And when you're working on difficult problems, that is really not what you need. It also means that you don't get any actual break for your brain or for your eyes, so it ends up just being exhausting. Sorry. Okay, so this is really, really useful if you struggle to stay focused on your work. Another little trick that you can use is if you find that you're looking at the timer, every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes. Have pen and paper next to your computer and just make a note of the distractions that pop up. So it might be that you're sitting down to write something, and after 2 minutes you think, oh, I really need to go on Amazon because I want to buy an electric pencil sharpener, right? Something you absolutely do not need, but for some reason your brain latches onto, that's the one thing that's going to make me an amazingly productive writer. Write it down and note the time, and then bring your attention back to the work. 2 minutes later, your brain will say, oh, now's the time when I need to go online and check to see whether I've got the best deal on my mobile data plan, right? Note it down, go back to the work. Then maybe it's 4 minutes later, the next thing comes up. And then maybe it's 10 minutes later, and you find again that the brain settles. But what this does is it gives you something to do with those thoughts. So instead of just saying, I must stay focused, must stay focused, must stay focused, which is difficult, it gives you somewhere to put them. And then anything that is actually important, you've noted it down, and you can actually, you can do it later. It also starts to develop an awareness of what your brain is actually doing. And then you can recognize it in the moment, recognize when you're tempted to procrastinate in some way, and then gently bring your attention back. We start to train that as a new habit. One thing that helps with this is using internet blocking software. So using a timer does help, but it also helps if you just remove the choice of going online, remove that as an option. So back when I was working on my thesis, I decided that I was going to work from home rather than in the department here, where I had no internet connection. So I had a nice desk set up with a computer on there. So if I was sat at the computer, it was physically impossible to get online. For the first few days, I found myself clicking on the browser. Not for any particular reason, it wasn't even a conscious thought, I just found myself doing it. But then, because I didn't get the reward, within a couple of days, that habit just faded away. And there was the minor inconvenience that if I needed to download a paper, I would have to cycle into the university to do so, or even to check email, I would have to go somewhere else. But that time was by far the most productive and actually the most enjoyable part of the whole PhD. So when most people were at their maximum stress in those final few months, I actually quite enjoyed it because I didn't have all of that stuff and I didn't have the guilt of thinking, oh, why have I wasted all this time online? So I could just sit, relax into the work, and it was actually quite good fun. And I ended up writing my entire thesis from start to finish in just 3 months. So this is an absolute game changer. These days, so when I wrote my thesis, it was 2007, which was around the time the first iPhone came out. So it was easier back then to be offline. Nowadays, way more difficult, we're way more integrated. So I use internet blocking software. There are 2 specific ones I use, one called Cold Turkey, which is on my laptop. So that's set up so that from 9 a.m. till 6 p.m., I can't access news websites, I can't access Amazon, I can't access YouTube or any other social media, and just removes that option. And then there's another one on my phone where I have similar things set up. So I use a combination of scheduled blocks, like the example I just gave, and timed blocks as well, that I can start when I need to focus. So if I'm writing, then I'll just block the browsers completely. So again, I'm recreating that situation where all I can do is work. This makes a huge difference. Okay, so where you are within this cycle. So I mentioned that you'll be stepping in and out of the kind of creative mode and the productive mode constantly throughout your PhD. So you plan, you take action, things go wrong, and you think and revise. But the amount of time you spend in those 2 different phases, or the way that you prioritize them, will vary throughout your PhD. And there are 3 rough phases, right? So don't take this as any kind of sharp lines where you're doing this for this time and then this and then this. And it's just a question of emphasis. So the first phase, foundational skill development. So early in your PhD especially, it's all about developing those basic skills. Then once you've got that foundation, then it's about getting the results and interpretation and a lot of problem solving. And then finally, it's about getting it finished. So in the early phase, so for those of you just starting a PhD, where this often goes wrong is, first of all, aiming too high. So if you're designing your own project, you probably want to do really well. You want to impress your supervisor. You want to get published. You want to do amazing things. You want to change the world. That's great. It's good to have that level of ambition. But what you need to recognize is that as PhD students, you're at the very, very, very beginning of a potential academic career. And very few academics do their best work at PhD level. So your ambition might be up here, but if your skill level is down here, then it doesn't matter how hard you work, you cannot cross that gap. And all that will happen is you'll get overwhelmed. So what we need to do is keep the ambition, but recognize that's for the long term. And in the short term, bring it way down here. So your immediate goal should be just beyond what you can currently do. So that might be just learning how to use a piece of equipment, learning a particular technique. Okay. So forget about getting results and just focus on that initial familiarization with basic equipment and techniques. Second, underestimating how long things will take. Third, trying to do too many things at once. So when you're learning new techniques, it takes your full attention, right? Even if it's something quite fundamental. But then gradually, as you develop skills, you need less and less conscious effort to do that, and you can start bringing in other things. So if you're learning, this could be experimental techniques, or it could be looking at the literature. Try and focus on just one or two things at a time, and don't try and do everything. Fourth point, mentioned this a little bit already. So anticipate that you will make mistakes, and a lot of things will go wrong, but see it as learning opportunities, right? So everything that goes wrong is information that you can use to adapt to. And the final thing, I do think this happens a little bit more in the social sciences, but for some people in this early stage, they put far too much emphasis on reading the literature over practical skills. Now, I am not saying that you shouldn't read the literature. However, some people find a certain amount of comfort in just engaging with other people's work. Because if you're just reading and reading and reading and reading, that can be a justifiable way of avoiding doing your own work, because your own work is risky, because it might go wrong, right? So you need both. And I would say in the first year of the PhD, just do stuff, just get experience. And that will actually help your understanding of the literature. Because once you've used a technique and then you see somebody else writing about it, you can say, oh, that's really cool. I can apply that. I can see how I can apply that. Or you can say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And you start to realize that not everything that's published is actually any good. It's an important insight. Okay, so initially, forget about results and focus on skills. Start with established techniques, learn the basics under easy conditions, and then practice each step of data collection and analysis on a small scale where results don't matter or mistakes don't matter. And then gradually you can apply this to more complicated issues. So having developed a foundation of basic skills, it then gets easier to predict how long some things will take and to form a plan. But then when something goes wrong, what do you do? So this is where that awareness of your basic habits and where your brain goes is really useful. So do you switch tasks to stay productive? So sometimes people will, something will go wrong over here, but they've got a million other experiments going on, so they'll just switch and switch and switch and switch. So they stay busy, but they never slow down to actually solve any of the problems that arise. This also happens, by the way, in writing. So some people will tell you, when you get stuck, just write about something else. The problem with that is that you stay sort of productive, but it means that anytime you hit anything difficult, you're training yourself to just avoid it. And eventually you run out of easy things to say, And what you're left with is all the difficult stuff at the end, but you haven't learned how to solve those problems. So this applies both to research and writing as well. Okay. So what do you do when things go wrong? Do you just keep going, or do you disengage or distract yourself by going online? This is probably the most important question. What do you do when things go wrong? Because that's where you need to be at your most engaged and most creative, because dealing with stuff going wrong is what being an academic is, I think, mostly all about. Okay. So slow down and think, take the pressure off, and then try and think beyond the obvious. Give yourself a few options, make a decision, come back to it. Final point in here is to try and do things as carefully as you possibly can, especially when you're in that middle phase, right? So early on, it's all about just getting a bit of experience. But then when you're really pushing for results, sometimes if you're trying to go too fast, you end up doing things a little bit sloppily. In my case, when the sort of dark middle stages of the PhD, things went wrong so often, and the equipment broke so often that I think I got into a mindset that this is never going to work. So I kept going into the lab, I kept working, I was putting in effort on some level, but I was very often rushing. And there's kind of a cycle. So sometimes I would delay work early in the morning, kind of get to it just before lunch, and then so then I would rush some of the preparation. Then I'd be doing the measurements, and then just not doing things as carefully as I could. So then, of course, things didn't work. So that reinforced that cycle of thinking, well, it's never going to work. So what's the point? And one of the things that really changed towards the end was I just slowed down and said, you know what, I'm going to do this as carefully as I possibly can. And funnily enough, that's when things started working. Not everything, but the success rate just tipped the balance enough that got enough for a couple of publications, and ultimately, the PhD and the postdocs and everything else. Right. So don't underestimate the importance of just taking care of the things that you do. Then finally, just a couple more points, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Final phase, so getting things finished. So as you go through the middle phase and you're getting results, you're trying lots of different things, you're gradually, kind of getting somewhere near completion. You probably will have started many, many, many different things. And you'll also have many different ideas for where you can take it. So usually in most projects, the more you do, the more avenues of potential research open up, the more questions open up. Unless you're doing a really boring project where it's just like, well, here's the answer. In most cases, it will raise more questions than it answers. So you will have lots and lots and lots of things that could potentially go into your thesis. The only way to actually finish is to let go of some of that stuff, to be decisive and stop exploring new options. So this is where we shift the mindset towards the productive and the decisive. So going back to the Apple analogy, they'll have 1,000 different options they could use for the next iPhone. They have to make final decisions months in advance and say, right, we're not doing this, not doing this, not doing this. This is what we're going with. And that's what you need to do. So you have to reach a point where you say, okay, these are the things which are definitely going into my thesis. These are my best results. These are the most interesting things. Some of that, if you're lucky, you maybe got published, so it's already done. But then there'll be things which are kind of, this needs a bit more work, that needs a bit more work. And you need to do kind of a sort of triage where you decide this is the stuff that I'm going to put extra effort into and try to get finished. All of this other stuff, I need to let that go. And maybe you come back to that as a postdoc. Maybe you leave that for somebody else. But the only way you can finish is to let things go and make that decision. And we need to narrow the focus, set clear goals, and make decisions based on the time available. So where deadlines often slip is that in the weeks or months before, we're just working, just keep going, just keep working, just keep working, and not adapting based on the amount of time you have left. So if, for example, let's say you're writing, because it's an easy thing to talk about, you say, right, I've got 6 months left, I've got 6 chapters. That gives you a month per chapter. Let's say you're 3 weeks in and you've written 2 pages. To have any chance of meeting that 6-month goal, something has to change. And the issue that people have where they don't meet those deadlines is they're not making those alterations early enough. They're not responding to the time available and adapting what they decide to do. So you've got to make decisions based on the time available. But then finally, there's often a mental barrier to making these decisions. Because even though everybody wants to submit their thesis, everybody says they want to finish, submission means taking the risk that maybe the examiners don't like it. And this is where we come back to that fundamental difference between undergraduate and a PhD. At undergraduate level, if you'd done the work, if you'd learned the things you were told to learn, you knew you were going to pass, unless something really, really, really bad happened. But at PhD level, you don't know how the examiners are going to respond. Maybe they're going to find some fundamental mistake that you and your supervisor missed, and you just don't know. And so sometimes people avoid making these decisions because of that subconscious fear. And the only way to finish, because you'll never have an absolute guarantee, the only way to finish is to say, you know what? I'm just going to take the risk. The examiners might not like this, but I'm just going to do what's in my control. I'm going to submit on time and we'll see what happens. Because the confidence to finish, it can't come from a sense of certainty in the outcome. At PhD level, we just don't have that. And the confidence, I think, comes from accepting that things might not work out the way you want them to, but just giving it your best shot anyway and trusting in your ability to cope with whatever happens. And if you can find that mindset, maybe counterintuitively, it takes some of the pressure off. And that's when research can actually be fun, because you just focus on what's in your control and not worry too much about the end result. So I think that's a good place to stop. So we'll get into the Q&A. So you can ask me anything about anything we talked about, or basically anything PhD related. So these are some typical topics that come up that I often talk to students about. So basically, ask me anything. We've got about 45 minutes, I think. So take advantage and ask me anything. Yeah.
So in terms of like writing a thesis,
Yes.
would you set deadlines for that?
Yes. Yeah. So if you don't have an externally applied deadline, then I think it's a very good idea to set your own in terms of how much longer are you willing to dedicate to this process. So I've worked with quite a few students who don't have that external deadline, and in some cases they've been working on it for years, and a lot of them get stuck in that cycle of thinking, well, I want to finish, but I also don't want to take that risk. And so they just keep revising, and adding more things, and then deciding, oh, I'm going to throw this away. I'm going to, take my thesis in a whole different direction. And the longer that goes on, the harder it is to break out of it. So I think it's a very good idea to have a date where you say, right, I'm going to be done by this date, no matter what. But in order to meet that, again, you've got to make decisions based on the time available. So to meet that, my approach is a little bit different to what a lot of people advise. So a lot of people will say, just get words down, keep writing until you've got a first draft, then then go through and start revising it. I have never seen that work well in 15 years of coaching students. Because what happens is if you're just getting words down and not making decisions, then what I see in the text is people just say the same things over and over and over again, right? Because they just keep writing what's easy. In some cases, they don't even read what they've written, because that's what people advise. So the way I approach it is to say, start with the introduction. Again, a lot of people say do the introduction last. But if you do the introduction, it forces you to make decisions about what is it that this thesis is actually about. So when I speak to people and they can't tell me what the thesis is actually about, then there's a big problem. And then there's no point writing a literature review chapter, if you don't know, well, why why are we doing this, right? So start with the introduction. And I generally try and get people to get it to as close to a submittable standard as possible before moving on. So then you've got to take care of all the details. You've got to take care of the formatting. You've got to take care of the references. But then you've got a chapter where you say, you know what, it may not be perfect, but I could submit this. Right? Then literature review, framed around the goals of the thesis, then methods, then everything else. So then by the time you get to say chapter 5, you might still have a fair amount of work to do, but you've got stuff that you can submit. So it gets you into that habit of actually finishing things and not saying, well, this is just a first draft, I can always come back to this, because then you're stuck in that loop forever. So that's how I generally approach it.
Okay, cool.
I have two questions. First, working with literature, because this is my second week since I started my PhD.
Yeah.
And I have a scope to focus on with my supervisor as we agree. And I'm getting confused with everything in literature. So I came every time I have no idea, new idea.
Yeah.
And then I ended up with millions of ideas, so I can't focus on. What I have to focus on. So
Okay.
what would you recommend for literature?
Okay, great question. So first of all, I would say this is something that almost everybody goes through, and it's one of the biggest challenges as you go into a PhD. Again, because all the stuff that you came through, it was all structured, right? So you may have had to study a lot up to this point, but now you're looking at the academic literature, and instead of having a nice, neatly structured syllabus or textbook, it's just this mess of tens of thousands of interconnected, contradictory papers, right? And so if you try and approach it as if you were studying, where it's just, well, I've got this stack of books to get through, I just need to read them and take notes, you'll be doing that forever. And you probably won't actually learn that much from it, because you'll just be overloaded. So from all of those tens of thousands of papers, I would say try and identify, to start with, 5, right? Which ones you choose initially to start with, if you have a rough idea of the subject area that you're interested in, then there may be thousands and thousands of papers on that particular topic. But of those thousands and thousands, most of them will be fairly incremental, inconsequential. But then there'll be there'll be a handful that in some way changed the field or influenced the way that everybody else thinks about things. So let's say somebody invents, because it's medicine, isn't it, that you're studying, right? So let's say somebody develops a new treatment or a new diagnostic tool, right? There might be thousands of papers that use that particular tool. But if you go back to the original source and say, right, what did they do that was so revolutionary? How does it differ from what came before? And then what influences it had? Then that will give you a much better foundation of understanding than spending weeks just reading loads and loads and loads of papers. So try and identify what's the underlying technique or theory or idea, and just spend a little bit of time on that. Right? Then you could maybe, if there's a lot of literature on, on that, I'll just stick with the idea that it's a diagnostic tool. If there's a lot of literature on that, someone's probably written a literature review. So find that, right? So you've got the original source, you've got a literature review, and then maybe, there'll be some concepts that come up, or you'll notice, oh, like this other name keeps coming up, right? Then maybe that directs you to say, oh, let's go and understand that particular idea. So you can spend some time, identify a few groundbreaking papers, a couple of literature reviews. Within the literature reviews, you can identify what are the ongoing debates or problems that exist in the field. Right? So it could be, let's say, that diagnostic tool is very expensive. So people are trying to find ways of doing it, more economically, right? Understanding that that's something that people are working on, you don't need to read a load of papers in order to do that, to get all of the details, but you understand, well, this is a problem. And then maybe there's a couple of different major approaches. Then it's, oh, that's really interesting. Now I'm going to focus on this and I'm going to read these 20. Right? But then you've got the context and you've got the foundation in order to be able to do that. But if you just got a stack of papers or thousands of search results and you're just reading stuff, it takes a very, very long time. Or yeah, if ever, because there's always new ideas, right? So it's identifying what's actually going to be useful to you. And then, yeah, so get a sense of what is there and the kind of problems that people are working on. And remember that you can always go back to the literature, right? So maybe you read a review and there's like 5 different areas which are kind of interesting. Area number 5, so, oh yeah, I'm not so interested in that right now, but you go off in this direction. Then you remember, oh yeah, some people are working on that. Maybe it becomes relevant. And then you can go back and look at that stuff in a bit more depth. But it's a process that will never stop. You'll constantly be going back to literature again and again and again and again. And you don't have to, well, I think it's impossible to just make kind of comprehensive notes and use those as a study guide for the literature. It just doesn't work that way. You can't treat it like an undergraduate exam where this is the stuff you need to learn. It's very iterative and organic. So start with, find 5 interesting papers, groundbreaking ones, that have had an influence. You may find that when you do that, they're quite difficult to understand, but then you can look at secondary sources. You can look at Wikipedia. You can possibly ask ChatGPT some stuff, but be careful with it. And always read, you can ask it questions, but then make sure you read the paper and you actually understand it and verify that ChatGPT got it right. Because it's often brilliant, but sometimes it will make mistakes in spectacular ways.
This is my second question. So I read about 10 papers so far about the topic. And to save my time going through the whole, paper, sometimes 10, 20 pages, and sometimes it's difficult to go through every details, unless, especially if the paper related to topic. So I uploaded on ChatGPT and asked him to summarize it for me. And I don't know what's your point of view about using ChatGPT that way. Same time.
Yeah, I'm not sure how valuable it is to just say summarize this for me, because each paper has an abstract. So you've already got the summary. So why do you need another summary?
I mean, for each section, for instance, if I want to understand their methodology, how they their project, so I upload the methodology for ChatGPT analysis. How was the methodology like? So I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So in that case, so I would ask why. So why are you looking at the methodology at this particular point, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but it depends why. So when you're deciding how to approach the literatures, what are you actually trying to achieve at any given point? So if you want to do, so let's say there's 10 studies on this, diagnostic tool, right? And you want to do a comparison of the methods, so if you're doing kind of a meta-analysis of some kind, then you'll probably have some inclusion criteria, or you'll be judging the quality of the sources. So maybe you want to use ChatGPT to just get a quick sense and say, well, let me know, let me know the sample sizes of these papers, right? Yeah, it can do that work. But what you would then need to do is still go through and read those parts. So if you need to do an in-depth comparison of the methods behind papers, you can get ChatGPT to do a quick scan. Absolutely, and why not, right? It's it's a very good tool for that kind of thing. But then if your analysis in any way depends on actually going through and comparing those methods, you've got to do that yourself. Because if you're going to then publish that review and put your name on it, I would never trust ChatGPT to do thinking for me that I put my name. Just no, because then somebody else comes along and says, "Well, that's wrong," and you've got no defense. And I would say, yeah, I just wouldn't trust it at that level. So there's a really good analogy. It's not my own. I think it was from a guy called Kevin Kelly. He said that AI is like an intern. So you can get it to do kind of menial tasks, but then you've got to check it, right? And you need to have a good enough understanding, in this case of research methods, that you can say, "Oh, that's a good paper, that's a bad paper." Right? At this stage, you probably don't have that knowledge. So then you've got to learn, if it's, say, based on clinical trials, get a really good understanding of how a good clinical trial should be run, right? So that, again, is that foundational understanding that doesn't come from reading thousands of papers. It comes from understanding the fundamentals. Then you can look at the papers and say, well, that's rubbish, that's rubbish. Oh, that's kind of gold standard, and then you can divide it that way.